Cost-plus contracts can run into trouble when the government takes 5 years to audit indirect costs. That's what happened to a Navy contractor and how it has $1 million dispute. They're in court over the details, and Federal Drive host Tom Temin discussed it with Haynes Boone procurement attorney Zach Prince.
And this all seems so routine that you have a cost-plus contract, there's direct costs, easy to bill, indirect. Tell us what happened here and what the cautionary tale here is.
Sure, Tom. So some background is probably helpful. I know this is an arcane area in government contracts, but when you've got a cost type contract, the basic idea is that your costs are reimbursed. You've got your actual cost experience. The government pays for that with some caveats for the things the government has decided they don't pay for. And then on top of that, you've got a fee. It's fixed typically in advance because otherwise there's an incentive to run up the costs. And it should be fairly routine. You submit your invoices as you perform for your direct costs, but every business is going to have indirect costs. That is back office support, things that aren't directly tied to one government contract. They support your whole operations. The way you get paid for those is you get paid based on a ratio that's developed, a percentage that gets applied to your direct costs. As you go through things during your year of performance, it's an estimate. It's provisional. You get it trued up at the end of a fiscal year. You send the government a proposal. The government's supposed to audit it in a reasonable time or decide that they don't need to audit it, come up with a final rate, and then you have a true-up audit invoice. You send an invoice to the government for more money if your rates are higher, or potentially you owe the government a credit if your rates are lower than you had assumed. The problem is, especially in the mid-2010s, the government had a massive backlog in these types of contracts where they'd have proposals that would sit there for years, where the Defense Contract Audit Agency did nothing until the very last minute when maybe they would disclaim the ability to do an audit for whatever reason, and then they throw it back over to DCMA or the Navy or Army or whoever it is, and they would have to say, okay, what do we do with this now? Usually this is years after a cost has been incurred. The people who are there at the company at the time aren't there anymore to justify why they did cost X, Y, or Z. And it creates these very messy disputes. Most of the time, it hasn't mattered to the government. I mean, Congress has gotten involved and has put a lot of pressure that has gotten things a little better. But practically day-to-day administration, if the government takes 5 years, it just means they're in a better position to challenge you because you have the burden of establishing that your costs were reasonable. The government doesn't. So now the government's in a position where they can say, forget about it. You can't get these costs back, and you don't have a lot of recourse.
Don't contractors calculate those costs on a government-approved accounting system and keep the records so that you can kind of just spit up the answer?
Yeah, they do, but there's a lot of flexibility there. And, you know, the nature of what it means to have an approved accounting system is somewhat of a matter of dispute. This case is a good example of it because in this case from the Court of Federal Claims, this company Reliability and Performance Technologies had 2 DCAA audits saying their accounting systems were approved. And then still a couple years down the road, DCAA said, we can't audit your incurred cost proposals because your accounting system wasn't sufficient. Begs the question, what did they audit and what was their conclusion?
All right. So what happened then when the government denied these? In other words, 5 years later, the government said these costs are not proper and $1 million of adjustment for the contractor didn't get paid.
So what's frustrating about this case is actually the government didn't say the costs weren't improper. The government said the costs were allowable. That is, they complied with the accounting system requirements. They didn't get rid of any of their costs on the basis of the government's arcane rules. They just said after 5 years, you contractor can't get this money back now because of the cost ceilings that are in these contracts. There wasn't enough money allocated to the contracts during performance. You're supposed to be telling the government regularly, you know, we're at 75% of what's been set aside for funding for this contract. You need to set more money. It's hard to do that with indirects, but the government said this is going to prevent you from recovering.
We're speaking with Zach Prince. He's a partner at the law firm Haynes Boone. So then the contractor took him to court, and then what happened?
Yeah, so they brought up what I think is a really interesting argument that I've seen raised before, but not necessarily prevail yet, although I really think it should and it might here, that the government can't use the funding limitations as a basis to refuse to pay the contractor amounts that are owed because the government breached the contract first in two ways, both of which are stemming back down to their obligation to do an audit and true up of your indirect costs in a timely fashion that is not 5 or 6 years later, within a couple of months, maybe a couple of years at most, and that the government has an obligation to true up the provisional rates in a meaningful way during performance. So you can't just have the same provisional rates from year 1 to year 5. They should be adjusted so that the government doesn't have a situation where they've paid you too much or too little, and then you have to do this true up process later. It should be a fairly routine administrative process. It often doesn't happen that way.
And the court decided in favor of the contractor, but you're writing that it's not necessarily the answer to the bigger question.
They decided that way for now. So it's a summary judgment decision, which means that the government made the argument that there are no facts that could be construed against it, essentially, if it went to trial, that would entitle the contractor to judgment. So the court said, no. Based on what we've seen here, there's enough facts to establish that you, government, breached this contract in a couple ways, and that you can't prevent the contractor, or maybe won't be able to prevent the contractor from recovering based on these limitations of fund restrictions. Whether the court gets there in the end in a decision on the merits, it's an open question. I kind of doubt they're going to get to a decision on the merits.
What do you think will happen instead?
I think they're going to settle this. I mean, if I were advising the government or the contractor, I'd say we're talking about $1 million, not a lot of money. Litigation's expensive and it's time consuming. And it's clear that the court has a interest in ruling in the contractor's favor here, or at least acknowledging the equities that lie in favor of the contractor. You come to the table, you throw some numbers around, and you walk away.
Yeah, I mean, the government, the Navy, will re-baseline a program to the tune of $1 billion. 1/1000th of that they need to be able to find for a contractor when the government was, in effect, this is not the legal term, but negligent in how it handled indirect costs.
Yeah, that's right. And the government doesn't dispute that these are amounts that are allowable and that otherwise should be reimbursed to the contractor. So in all fairness, it's not like the contractor's trying to get one over on the government. The government doesn't suggest otherwise. It's just relying on this technicality that I think is a stretch anyway. It doesn't want a bad decision out there for itself later, which this I think could result in. It really ought to be coming to the table, which is unfortunate for the contractor community, honestly, because I'd like to see a decision on the merits in favor of the contractor here so that we can point to it in the future.
So what can contractors maybe do to prevent this from happening, and what could the government maybe do better?
So from the contractor side, I mean, they've got to be proactive when they've got their incurred cost proposals sitting out there for years. Contact your contracting officer, do it regularly, or your administrative contracting officer, and say, this is sitting out there and we are having trouble figuring out our firm responsibilities when we don't know what the rates are, and we need help. They also could do a better job of telling the government, hey, we need our rates that are being used on a provisional basis for billing to reflect reality so that nobody is left holding the bag down the road. On the government side, they've got to do a better job of administration. It's not just the Navy, it's everyone in DOD and certainly everyone in civilian agencies. I'm seeing, and have been for years, rates getting trued up at the very end of the 6-year statute of limitations, the window when you have to challenge anything. And that's because of there are pressures internally and there's backlogs, and totally get it. But you can't let it sit that long because you'll never be able to figure out these disputes if you wait that long.
Procurement attorney Zach Prince is a partner at Haynes Boone, speaking there with Federal Drive host Tom Temin. We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.